All right, we're going to just flip through the slides that we had last week, just so we're on the same page. We're all seeing the same thing and thinking about the same thing. This will be particularly important because we'll end the class talking about the immorality of homosexuality, but really can't grasp the immorality without understanding the standard to start with. There's no standard of immorality if there's not any morality. And so the design of God is obvious. It's was designed for our good. If we would all understand that and we would comply to that, then we would avoid all the calamities of life. When we began to question whether God's design is for our good, and we began to devise our own way, we always get in trouble. It was also designed to endure. So this is not something that's going to change over time. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court might say or what the majority of the people might say. It's not going to change over time. And it doesn't matter about those things. We need to fully understand that God's design for marriage is the same. We mentioned last week, Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, that marriage bed is undefiled. It is to be mutually gratifying. He uses the relationship between husband and wife to illustrate, in a spiritual context, Christ's relationship to the church. So we know it was intended to be mutually gratifying. In fact, he emphasizes within the broader context there that ultimately we need to understand that we are to submit ourselves one to another. And we do that for the benefit of the other person in the marriage. A lot of marriages are formed the person looking for someone to provide something for them rather than what can they provide for the marriage. When I do premarital counseling, we spend some time allowing them to illustrate, articulate what they anticipate, what they're looking for in a spouse. And once they kind of do that, it's kind of insightful. And then I give them time in the next session to tell me what they bring to the marriage. What is it that you bring that would enhance this relationship? What do you offer this person that you're asking to spend the rest of their life with you? What do you offer? Sometimes it's a little disconcerting to them. Hadn't really thought about that part, what they might bring. But it's to be mutually meaningful. And when that is not the case, and it's not the way God designed it, He intended for both parties to benefit from that relationship, is to be maintained faithfully. And when adultery is mentioned in Galatians chapter 5, then obviously we understand that someone hasn't been faithful. Someone has broken those vows, and it was intended to last. And this is just a matter of review. And so adultery is that moral disregard for what God has designed to be beautiful and right and good and pure. The bed becomes defiled. They bring someone else into the bed, so to speak. And we use that terminology in a very flippant way in our society. We talk about people who are having sexual relationship outside of marriage as they're sleeping with someone. And so we really degrade what God designed for marriage to be. And that's sad. It's an illicit sexual conduct of a married person. Might be with another married person or just somebody outside of that marriage, but one of the people involved in something being described as adultery is they're married and they break the vows that they made to the person they're married to, and they have intercourse with someone outside of that marriage. Illicit. It's not allowed. It's me focused. Anytime we break those vows, it's for selfish motives. Always. I don't know of a case I've ever counseled where when adultery has occurred, it wasn't for selfish reason. I think that's where we maybe ended last week. Can't remember exactly. I got a little wordy, so the slides I intended to cover, I don't think I covered all of them. But adultery is a dethroning of God. And when you get to Matthew chapter 19, you have that kind of illustrated, don't you? When people came to the Lord and asking him what Moses allowed putting away their spouse. And he said from the beginning it wasn't so. And verse 6 says, what man had joined together, let that man put asunder. So if man does something to break that relationship, who's been dethroned? And I tell couples all the time, they're heartbroken, obviously, when they experience a spouse who has been unfaithful to them, and they're just crushed. And they say things like this, and I can understand the terminology. I'm not making light of what they say. But they say, I can't believe they would do that to me. I thought they loved me. And I don't try to soften it for them, but I'll say, they did it to God before they did it to you. They run faithful to God before they run faithful to you. And if any of us can get to that point where we can dethrone God and break the relationship that we have with God, there's not a relationship that we can't break. There's just not. Is there? See, that has to be the ultimate standard. And when we get into the confusion of our world about ethics and morality, it's because that God's left out. And once you can leave him out, you're going to struggle trying to have some consensus of what's ethically right, what's morally right, and that's going to evolve depending on how many people feel a certain way at a certain time. And it's happened in our society all around us. And with that, that diminishes man. I think maybe we, and you can remind me if I've already covered that and you don't want to hear it again. I'll probably read it again, but I'll at least empathize that you feel like I've spent enough time on it. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 15, it says, know ye not that your bodies are the members of Christ? Shall you then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? God forbid. What? Know ye not that which is joined to a harlot is one body? For two, saith he, is one flesh. But he that is joined to the Lord is one spirit. Flee fornication. Every sin that a man doth is without the body. But he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which you have of God, and you're not your own? For you are bought with a price, and therefore glorify God in your bodies and your spirit, which are God's. So if you can dethrone God, and that is say, I don't belong to you, you don't rule my life, then you allow yourself then to be diminished from who God intended for you to be. You'll devalue yourself in that process, and it describes that here as being joined to a harlot, and that you can't separate yourself, your body, from that act, and that's a diminishing experience. When we say immoral, we need to understand it's a diminishing context. There is a moral standard. There is a moral purity. And immorality is a diminishing of that. And it destroys God's plan. We've gone over the plan a number of times from Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. Thus shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Now, I just described in reading 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that when we use our body for purpose of fornication, something other than God designed it for, then we've broken that pattern. We become joined to a harlot. We become joined to another flesh that was never intended to be part of that relationship, because when a man leaves his father and mother, and a woman leaves her father and mother, and they join themselves to each other, they become one flesh. And you then destroy that pattern, which is supposed to be beautiful and represent Christ and his relationship to the church. Not really shocked, are we, when we look around at the denominational world, because that really is spiritual adultery. You can be joined to as many as you like. And we even say in a very flippant way in a religious world in which we live, just join the church of your choice. We say that as a society, don't we? in a spiritual context, and we've dethroned God and said He doesn't choose for us. He doesn't have anything to do with that spiritual marital relationship. And so we're really not shocked when that becomes a difficult thing for us to make application of in our marriages. That becomes more important. I want to spend a little more time on that tonight before we get into the other subject matter, and I'll share a story with you when we get there. But adultery grieves God. We've mentioned Matthew's account, but in Mark's account, in Mark chapter 10 and verse 9, he reminds us that which God had joined together, let not man put asunder. If man does put it asunder, and God had joined it together, it grieves God. He put that relationship together so we could be helpmeets to each other, so that we could help protect each other, so that we could assist each other in our journey toward heaven. He meant for that to be a protection, always. And that grieves Him when that's no longer the case. It's grounds for divorce. That's what adultery is in the context of Matthew chapter 19, even though they had a broader desire in mind, and that is a person got tired of their spouse, they just put them away for any reason. That's what they desired. But He emphasized to them the only exception to the putting away here and remarrying was if there's adultery involved. And He mentions that in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9. So when we understand that and we see that, we recognize that that's grounds to put that spouse away because they have broken those vows and they have joined their flesh to the flesh of a harlot, as was described in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. But Jesus asked in Matthew 19 and verse 9, or He says in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery. And whosoever marrieth her which is put away, committeth adultery. So we don't have any business dissolving that which God has put together, and we certainly can't join someone else to that relationship that God has not joined to that relationship, and that's the exception that He gives. It's a grave consequence involved in adultery. That's where we started this discussion last week, is Galatians chapter 5. Adultery is listed among those things that Paul says, they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Serious matter, isn't it? We get uncomfortable sometimes talking about it, and sometimes our life gets a little complicated and we get offended when we have the conversation. We should never have the conversation in a way that would pretend like we're holier than someone else, or that we have all the answers, or we prescribe somebody unclean, and that has nothing to do with it. When we're talking about ethical and moral standards, we're talking about being holy as He's holy. And there's a certain relationship that we have to maintain with Him to be faithful to Him. And there's a certain relationship that we have to maintain with each other in our marriages to be faithful to each other and to Him. And when those things are violated, there are grave consequences. We will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. We just won't. Now, we can script that any way we want to. We can say, well, he didn't really mean that. Well, we can redefine what adultery is. We can redefine the exceptions, and we can do all sorts of things, and that's where we started this discussion. What are the ethical and moral standards that we are to live by? And if we can't do that in our own spiritual lives and in the church, we shouldn't expect to have any kind of definition or clarity in the world in which we live. We've had some complications with that, haven't we, as spiritual people? We've compromised on some of those things because it's uncomfortable. But you see, you don't get any more uncomfortable than saying you have no right to the kingdom of heaven. That makes me uncomfortable. I'm not comfortable with that at all. I want to inherit the kingdom of heaven. I want to go to heaven more than anything else in this world. And if I love someone, I want them to go to heaven. I wouldn't want to be selfish and have a relationship with someone that's going to cost them their soul. See, that's moral standard. We started with our definitions of ethics and morality is do no harm. If you're a lawyer, you have to say you're bound to make sure your decisions are you do no harm. If you're a medical doctor, you're bound by your Hippocratic oath, you do no harm. But we come to the spiritual matters, and because it's uncomfortable for us and the conversation is not always pleasant, we compromise on things that do harm. Jeopardizes soul. Serious matter. Grave consequences. Our moral response ought to be, obviously, if the process dethrones God, what we have to do is enthrone God. We have to put him back where he belongs. Isn't that what Jesus said? Have you not read that he which made them from the beginning made them male and female? And then described that marital process? See, he had to put God back where he belonged. Now, they began to say, you know, Moses said we could do this, and he said, Moses, because the heart is of your heart, but have you not read? Do you not know who God is and what God has said? And so when we began to have discussions, and someone may come up and say, Brother Jerry, what do you think about, I have to be real careful. Because, folks, I'll just be honest with you, it does not matter what I think at all. Did you hear me? It doesn't matter what I think. It matters what God said. And so I need to read and study and see what God said, because Paul told Timothy, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. I want to be right with God. And if I'm right with God, I'm going to be right with you. Because if I'm not right with you, I'm not right with God. But if I get that part right, if I love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, then he's enthroned. He's where he belongs and where he wants to be and where he demands to be. Then we need to embody the fruit of the Spirit. In contrast to those who will not inherit the kingdom of heaven, he describes the fruit of the Spirit. If all marriages were filled with the fruit of the Spirit, we're going to treat each other the way we should. We're going to have everything God designed for us to have, and we'll embody those things. Then we embrace our spouse. If you allow distance to occur in your relationship, you don't talk to each other, and you don't, as Ephesians chapter 5 described it, you don't submit one to another. You don't provide for each other what you need. You're always saying, you don't ever do this for me. You don't ever do that for me, rather than saying, what can I bring to the relationship? If you allow distance to occur, eventually, you're living with a stranger. You don't have anything in common. You're not functioning as one in any fashion. Not function as one emotionally, and not function, one as one flesh. You're not functioning one spiritually, and that becomes a very detrimental thing. And 1 Peter chapter 1 describes, even in a context where one of those evidently is a Christian and one's not, that you behave in such a way that they'd be won by your chaste manner of life. But in that same context, the wife was to be the example being described there, but the husband was to dwell with his wife according to knowledge. Those are not foreign things to ethics and morality. It's the right thing to do. Remember when we boiled it all down and said, how do you really define it? Being right. Doing what's right. And those are things that we need to hold on to and be aware of. Now, the reason I did it in that order is I was counseling with a homosexual man one time, some time ago. And he's very emotional. He knew the sin he was guilty of. He was penitent of sin. He left the sin, but he was struggling with the relationships that he had experienced and the fondness that he had developed for someone of the same sex. It was sexual in nature. But in our conversation, he said something that I won't ever forget. He said, part of my struggle is I know what's wrong and I know what's right. And I really want to do what's right and I want to avoid what's wrong. But he said, when I assemble with Christians, and I listen to sermons, and I'm in Bible classes, they spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong with homosexuality, and he said they're absolutely right to do that. But he said, I've been in that church long enough to know that there are a whole lot of folks who are in an adulterous situation, and it's never mentioned. Never mentioned. And he said, yet I know if I practice homosexuality, I'll not go to heaven. And I'm glad people point that out to me, and I'm glad people encourage me to live a different lifestyle. But what about those who are guilty of adultery? They're not going to heaven either. It's not mentioned. I don't think that's can be categorically prescribed, because I know here we get sermons about every subject. But he was describing a relationship that you see in a lot of churches where you avoid certain subjects. But here's what he knew, and here's what I know. He knew eventually, and he and I had this conversation, he knew eventually that if one standard can be broken and one of God's laws can be overlooked and compromise of God's moral standards can be lessened, it'd just be a matter of time where the same thing would be true with homosexuality. He wasn't campaigning that they don't talk about homosexuality anymore. He wasn't asking there be no more sermons taught on those. He's saying, what about the souls of those who are committing other sins? There needs to be a standard that we all live by. He said, do you preach sermons on homosexuality? And I said, I have, and I do. He said, do you have any idea about the balance there? And I said, typically when I deal with the subject, I deal with it this way. I look at the list of sins and we go through the sins. The Lord listed the sins and such like. And I try to do that. But since then I've been more conscious of saying, what's the difference? And the reason I listed it this way, when you look at homosexuality, and there are a lot of Old Testament passages we could go to that specifically condemn it. But since we're talking about our moral and ethical standards, we're under the new law. And sometimes folks say, well, that's an Old Testament passage, and so it doesn't really apply to us. And so I wanted us to go to a New Testament passage, and I think it's interesting that you look at that. First thing you have to do, if you're guilty of homosexuality, you have to dethrone God, don't you? Because you see, when you read, like they were told to do in Matthew chapter 19, you read that God who made them in the beginning made them male and female. And then he said, thus shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And they twain, man and woman, husband and wife, would be one flesh. Now when you get to Romans chapter 1, you see that just like in adultery, God's dethroned, isn't he? Look at Romans chapter 1 and verse 21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but because became vain in their own imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into the image made like unto corruptible men, and to birds, and to four-footed beasts, and to creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, and therefore through the lust of their hearts to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Here it emphasizes to us that the first thing happens is they leave God out of their thinking. Their choice is to become their own God. He no longer occupies that place of reverence and occupies that place of authority. They glorified him not as God. To glorify means to exalt, doesn't it? They did not exalt him as the authority. And what happens when that takes place? If God's not there, you can make any choice you want to, can't you? But that was true with adultery, wasn't it? We use the same terminology. You dethrone God. We also said with adultery, you diminish man. Yes?
Just an observation about
Okay.
individual and mentioning about preaching on homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
I 1958. I don't remember a sermon on homosexuality all of my growing up years. And the reason you hear more about it now is kind of reactionary to the fact that we as a society are deemed acceptable now, whereas before it wasn't. And he's, you know, he was probably born a lot later than 1958, and maybe didn't live through all those years.
Yep.
It was never preached on. Everybody understood it was wrong.
You're right about the age bracket for him. I don't know that everybody knew it was wrong in the sense that a study of the Scriptures reveals all the sin. You know, if everybody knows it's wrong, they have to know that from study of the Scriptures. And if they know it's wrong, then it never becomes right. So I think maybe us not dealing with it at all until it became a problem, till it became public. Now all of a sudden it gave it that stigma that that's the only sin that somebody can be guilty of that is so hideous that we would withdraw our fellowship from them and we would not participate in it. So maybe it's always been in the Scriptures. And so if we never heard a sermon on it, why is that? You know, maybe we didn't describe it in the context so that people would understand that when you dethrone God, your minds can allow you to set your own standards, your own morality, your own ethical background, and you can become whoever you want to. There is a process to that, and maybe that was it, and maybe he was younger, and so, you know, in his immediate context, lots of sermons about that because it's in the news, people pushing for rights, wanting to be recognized as couples and marriage and be on each other's insurance, and so it's in the news all the time, and so we're looking at it and we're repulsed by it and we deal with it, and we should deal with it. He wasn't asking the people not deal with it. He just said, you know, it just seems that's the focus. He wanted to hear it. He didn't want to stop preaching about it. He really was compassionate about the other souls going to be lost because we're dealing with that now. Divorce is not particularly in the news because there's as many divorces as there are marriages today, so not news. Is it still a sin? Adultery is still a sin? Well, it is. So that, I think that's the point he's making. So I've tried to be conscious in my conversation with folks in Bible classes like this to say, look, sin is sin. And if I miss heaven for whatever sin it is, I'm going to miss heaven. And so we need to recognize that all sin is a dethroning of God. It is a transgression of God's law and His prescribed plan. But I appreciate that comment. It does diminish us. Verse 26 mentions that for this cause God gave them over to a reprobate mind, and they did change the natural use into that which is against nature. Now, who set the standards of nature? Well, God did. We go back and read what He recorded in the beginning, pretty clear. Everything produced after its kind, and there's this male and this female. And so we know that. You dethrone God, you leave that which is natural, and you look at what described here. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their own lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, receiving in themselves that recompense of error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God then gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispering, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. I've always been a little bit intrigued that a lot of the things that are listed in Galatians chapter 5 and a lot of the things that are listed here, we don't always have a real good understanding of what they're saying. Some of the things we do, adultery, we got a really clear understanding. Homosexuality, and the way it's described in very vivid detail here, we don't have any question about what he's talking about. But some of these other things about disobedient to parents and unmerciful, and those are the lesser sins to us, aren't they? If somebody's unmerciful, they're cruel. Same mindset. You can't be unmerciful when you have a merciful God enthroned. Can't be. You depend on Him for mercy, and when He is on His throne and you're conscious of who He is, you can't be unmerciful. I'm just saying that to say there's a mindset, there is a disposition that would cause us to commit any sin, and that just gets progressively worse in the sense that you would get totally, completely against nature, what you see and what you experience and what is contrary to how you designed. Would you be naturally designed to function? You could get to that point where it doesn't mean anything to you at all. You're blind to that. God would give them over to a reprobate mind, which means there is zero standards of morality. There are no ethical standards. Are we there, you think? Just within the last 5 years, kind of it seems to be a moral shift. I don't think we're going to be overreactive to those things because it's being portrayed as if there is this vast majority of the people have changed their mind about it. Don't believe that's true, number one. But the ones who are telling the story say it is. If they say it loud enough and long enough, we think, wow, everybody thinks it's okay. And yet when you have conversations with people and your neighbors with people, you know that's not everybody thinks that way. And it wouldn't matter if they did. We're not surprised because eventually God will give them over to that reprobate mind. Does that mean, since we're talking about ethical and moral standards in the 21st century, how do we determine that? See, eventually that'll just destroy the pattern and it dooms the soul. Verse 32 says, "And knowing that the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. Not only they that do the same, but have pleasure in them that do so." You see, people try to push you into a box and say, if you don't accept the behavior, then you're homophobic, you hate homosexuals, and therefore you're the problem. You're the one that really doesn't have a moral standard or moral compass. And for somebody who's not biblically informed, that can be intimidating. You think, whoa, no. But we're theophobic. We're God-fearing people. This context talks like God won't tolerate it. Not only those who practice that, but those who have pleasure in them that practice it. We should never be unkind to anyone. People can practice a lifestyle they want to. We can't be accepting of things that God's not accepting. It doesn't matter what context it comes in. It doesn't matter if there is a Supreme Court justice that describes it in his ruling that it's because of love and compassion. The time has come for us to recognize love in different forms. Does that sound like he placed himself in Romans chapter 1 and now he dethroned God and he's become God? But it's law. You see, where does our ethical moral standards... Is the bell rung? I can hear water, but I can't hear the bell. First bell has, okay? Our moral response, have to enthrone God. Notice in every one of these, we kind of get back to the same point because that is the ultimate moral standard. Not our place to put ourselves in a judicial sense to say we're going to determine who will accept or who will reject. We have to make sure we understand God's... Look at with me real quickly, and I'll mention these to you. You can take them home and read them. But in Romans chapter 6, we notice that it emphasizes. We usually go to this passage and talk about baptism, and that's okay, and that's true. But when you look at Romans chapter 6 and verse 13, neither yield yourselves members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. That you live for the purpose of representing God's standard of righteousness. Which takes us back where we started. We have to be like God. No, we don't become gods. We have to be like our God. He's good and He's merciful and He's loving and He's kind. And that fills us with that fruit of the Spirit. Then we have to make sure we execute sin. Whatever we nurture, folks, is going to grow. And if you have a little special place where you keep in a soft place sin that you don't practice it all the time, but you don't put it to death either, you're providing an opportunity for it to regain life and position in your life. Notice what he says here in Romans chapter 6 and verse 6. Know this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, and henceforth we should not serve sin. Those who struggle with homosexual are outside of marriage relationships. They say things like, but I love them. And you'll see the little rainbow that they use to illustrate gay relationships, and they'll say things like, love conquers all. That's lust, not love. Love does conquer all. If we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, it will conquer all, and it'll conquer sin. He'll help us put to death, mortify. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 says we are to mortify, put to death those things of the flesh. We execute them. If we leave them alive, kind of like the Old Testament Israel did with the Philistines, God said destroy them, and they kept them alive, and they hemmed them up over there by the Mediterranean Sea, and they made them hewers of wood and drawers of water. And next thing you know, they're serving them. How did that happen? You can't allow sin to stay alive. You have to put it to death. Then you escape the environment. Look at chapter 6 and verse 17. If the bell rung, just hang on just a second. They'll come in whether I'm talking or not, I think. Verse 17 says, for God be thanked that ye once were the servants of sin, but you've obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. You can't stay with the same people doing the same thing and be somebody different. And folks who have extramarital affairs say that, well, I love both of them. You cannot serve God and mammon. And when you exit that environment, you described in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 9, where not only is adultery mentioned again, but effeminate homosexuality is mentioned, and it says, such were some of you. But notice the escape, and notice the change of environment. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified. You've escaped. And that's what Romans chapter 6 described. You once were the servants of sin, but you have escaped. You're free. And now don't go back into that relationship. Don't nurture those feelings and those thoughts. We have to have that kind of attitude and disposition if we're going to have godlike, ethical, and moral standards. Appreciate your attentive nature and allow me to go just a little bit long on that one.